Hebrews chapter 11. Recently, we started a new series of studies on Thursday nights, and this is my semi-regular pitch that obviously some of us are incapable for a variety of reasons, circumstantial reasons, to be able to be out on Thursday nights for Bible study when we're all together. But if you're somebody who we don't know about it, but you just don't come just because you don't feel like it, come on. You're missing out. You're missing out on good times in the Word of God. You're missing out on some good learning. And what we're doing right now is trying to better understand the whole story of Scripture, to understand what God is teaching us throughout His story. And we looked this past Thursday night at the life of Abraham and the promises made to Abraham. And Lord willing, this coming Thursday, we're going to look at the family of Abraham. Today, I want us to think about both of them together, and particularly the lessons that are taught about them here in Hebrews chapter 11. I want to try to set the scene for us. Teleport yourself back thousands of years into the desert plains of the Middle East. And you'd find, particularly as you got close to the Mediterranean region, a fruitful, beautiful land. Not only would that land be fruitful and beautiful, but it would be really pretty impressive. The people that you would meet, cultures that had existed for centuries, walled cities, which I know for us we're like, sounds weird, why build a wall? But back then, that was the way to demonstrate your security, your strength, and your greatness, really. Filled with riches, filled with history, diverse peoples. Also, peoples that completely rejected the true God of heaven. People who worshiped false gods and committed all kinds of wicked practices, burning children alive in honor of their so-called gods, committing all kinds of acts of indecency and immorality to celebrate what they thought was really good. Maybe all that stuff kind of sounds a little familiar to the world that we occupy today. But as you fly over that place and those cultures, you'd see something a little strange. You'd see a lonely man with his wife and the people that worked for him and their flocks and herds, just going from place to place. And if you kind of parachuted down and met him and started talking to him, you'd be even more surprised. Because he wasn't wandering around in that land as a foreigner because he had to. You know, sometimes people there live in a nomadic lifestyle because they've got no other choice. Circumstances have forced them into it. But as you start talking to this man, you discover that he wasn't a nomad because he had to or because he thought it'd be fun. Matter of fact, he had a pretty nice life back east, back in the region of the Chaldeans, where really, that was where it really was. If Canaan had some impressive cultures, that place really did. Of the Chaldees, where there was, at least as they conceived of it, central heat and air, nice built up cities, ancient cultures, very sophisticated peoples, and he left. And you might say to Abraham, why would you do that? Why would you go and live this kind of life? That's what I'd like us to think about for a few minutes today. And let's go ahead and set the framework for what kind of life Abraham and his family lived. Did you notice it there in chapter 11 and go down to about verse 13? These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, having acknowledged that they were, and my guess is we've got different words there. Mine says strangers and exiles. Yours might say pilgrims. Yours might even say aliens. These same words are translated elsewhere in the New Testament as resident foreigners. I'm going to use this word to kind of sum up what we're talking about here. Abraham and his family were sojourners. They were sojourners. They were going somewhere. Now, they never really got to that somewhere, I'll be honest with you. Eventually, their descendants kind of did, but they never really got there. Their whole life was a life of sojourning, of being exiles, of being foreign residents, living in a place that wasn't really their place. Did you notice in verse 9 it says, by faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land. In other words, he didn't have a home. Matter of fact, it gets more specific. It says there in, somebody help me, verse 9, it says he was living in tents. Tents are temporary dwellings, movable dwellings, mobile homes, the original mobile home. That was their life. They were sojourners. They didn't have a place. They were on a journey, like we just sang. We are. And that's why this is an important story for us to know. Because the way God describes us, for instance, in places like 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1 and chapter 2 and verse 11, he says that we too are sojourners, that we are exiles on the earth. And so the story of Abraham is meant to serve as a prototype for all of us to understand how to go through this journey so that we will rise on wings of faith as we just sang and prayed. All right, so let's start with this. Sojourning is a difficult life. Sojourning is a difficult life. That's one of the first things we learn. Listen, starting in verse 8. I want to read down verses 8 through 12 to start as we learn about Abraham and his family of sojourners. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah, that is the wife of Abraham, herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Right here at the top, we get some indicators of the difficulty of a sojourning life. Now, by the way, I don't think I have to prove this to you because I think you know. Some of you have actually lived, maybe even right now, you kind of sense yourself as a sojourner, even in terms of where you live day to day compared to where you grew up or whatever. I think we can see this in people who are exiles from their homeland, people who are living somewhere that's not really their home. It's a difficult life. What's difficult specifically, though, about the sojourn of people of faith? The first thing is sojourners by faith, are people who have to live a life of submission. Remember, Abraham didn't go because he thought, you know what, I think it'd be good for my family to go on a little adventure. Ur of the Chaldeans is a little too comfortable and nice. Let's just go west and see what's going on out there. Let's go to Canaan. I hear it's wild out there. That's not why he went. What does it say in verse 8? By faith, Abraham thought it was a great idea. By faith, Abraham had an intuition. By faith, Abraham heard what some other people said. By faith, Abraham negotiated with God terms and conditions. By faith, Abraham obeyed. He obeyed when he was called. Abraham, why did you do this? Why did you go out on this, go and live this way? He was submitting to God. Maybe more on that in just a minute. I'll also say that the life of a sojourner is a life of displacement. We talk a lot about displaced peoples. People who have a home and a place, but then maybe there's a natural disaster, maybe there's some sort of conflict, maybe there's whatever the circumstance may be, and they are displaced from their home. If you're going to live the life of a sojourner, if you're going to submit yourself to God, you will always be a displaced person. You understand what I'm saying? There's an old hymn. This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. I don't care if you were born, raised, forever. Y'all ever talk to people from Maine? I don't think we have any Maine people here. Remember, I went to Maine one time. Okay, I didn't think so. I went to Maine one time, and I met this guy. We went to Bible study in the middle of the week with the saints there. And I meet this guy, and I say, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, blah. Where are you from? Or are you from here? I asked him. He said, oh, no, I'm not from here. I was like, oh, okay, where are you from? He's like, well, when I was 2, my parents moved us here. This guy, by the way, was like in his 40s. When I was 2, my parents moved us here, but I'm not from here. And I was like, what are you talking about? But then I started noticing all these people, and what I've understood, at least from those who've tried to explain it, is that if you're from Maine, it's got to be multiple generations, or else you're not really, people wouldn't count themselves being from here. Well, I'm really from somewhere else. Matter of fact, whenever people are introduced, they're like, oh, this is so-and-so. He's from away. Okay, what's that about? I don't know if that's all Maine people. Don't be prejudiced against Mainers, okay? But I'm just telling you my experience and what information I gained. Okay, you know what I think the problem is? Some of us think we can ever find a place that we belong. And I'm not hating on those Mainers, by the way. That's great debate. But you understand my point. We need to understand that all of us, are from away if we're living by faith. I don't care where you live, where you grew up, what your culture is. If you are a Christian, if you've decided to follow Jesus, you are from away. You are a displaced person wherever you live in this world. You're not from here. That's what was true for them. Notice what it says there in verse 8. It says he was called to go out to a place. Verse 8 continues. It says, and he went out. Notice how it emphasizes him being displaced, taken out of his place and from his home. Verse 9 again. By faith, he went. He was displaced to live in a land of promise as in a foreign land. Even though God said, this is your land, by the way. All of Abraham's life, God said, this land that you're living in, it's yours. But you don't get to have it. You don't even get a foot of it. It's yours, but it's going to come later. And then again, they're living in tents. They were displaced persons. Because of that, living a life of sojourning is a life of uncertainty. The reason why we all like having a place, having a home, this is my spot, is there's certainty that comes with that. I can kind of arrange things. I can kind of have things. I have at least in my imagination, hey, this is certain. This is secure. This is what I've got going on. But to live the life of a sojourner is, I don't know where we're going. Where are we going tomorrow? Whenever God called Abraham in Genesis 12, here's where God said he was going. He said, go to the land that I will show you. Uncertainty. Where is that going to be, Lord? I'll show you. Do you like that, by the way? We're back to this submission point at the very beginning. Do you like whenever somebody says, hey, just follow me there? We're going to go to such and such. Just follow. If you're ever driving in a car, they say, just follow me. Do you like that? I don't. I'm like, give me the address or give me at least directions. But follow you there. I don't know if you're a speed demon. I don't know what you're going to do. You may just run off and leave me. There's uncertainty that comes with being a sojourner. And with that uncertainty, and uncertainty is sort of a mental, emotional state to be in. But that uncertainty actually reflects a reality of insecurity. Insecurity. They were not secure people. They were exposed. They were out there. What are our resources for our flocks and herds? Whatever grass is growing, if it's growing. And by the way, go read Genesis chapter 13. They would have to find places. There was a time later in Abraham's family's life where the famine affected them too. They were under famine. What if we had just had our home? What if we had been able to preserve stuff for ourselves? There was insecurity that came with their sojourning. I'll say this, there's another one, and that is a sense of unbelonging. Part of the reason why we like having a place, part of the reason why we like that security, part of the reason why I want to be able to kind of set my own terms for where I'm going to be and how my life is going to go, is so that I can connect with, so that I can belong to someone or something or someplace. Y'all ever notice, I think this is, for those of us who are New York foreigners who've invaded over time, those of you who are real residents here, y'all probably notice how people show up here and immediately they start talking like they know everything about New York. You know what I'm talking about? Oh, that's New York for you. It's like, dude, you've been here 3 weeks. Like, settle down, bro. You're here for the summer. You know what I mean? But people, and that's not a bad thing. What is it? People want to belong. People want to be somewhere. People want to be connected to something. You know what being a sojourner means? You're signing up to not belong. You're signing up to not be as plugged in to everything and everyone going around you. We already noted the point that they lived as in a foreign land, as foreigners, as verse 13, strangers and exiles. Verse 14, they're seeking a homeland. I'll tell you something else. Being a sojourner is difficult because it's a life of waiting. You like waiting? You like waiting? I know you don't. And by the way, there's a lot of forces in this world where we're sojourning that condition us to be anti-waiting. If you show up to the bodega to get a sandwich, how quick do you want that thing? What if they told you, hey, we'll get it for you in about 30 minutes? 30 minutes? I'm walking across the street. I can't wait no 30 minutes. You can't wait 30 minutes for a sandwich? But we can't, can we? We need information immediately. We need, comfort immediately. I can't, if I'm in any kind of pain, something has to alleviate it immediately, right now. Living a life of a sojourn. And of course that gets bigger and bigger, right? We don't wait on things financially, and we make unwise financial choices. We can't wait in terms of things going on at work or in society or whatever. Waiting is something we don't like to do. Living the life of a sojourner is difficult because it is a life of waiting. Verse 13. These all, what happened? Died in faith. You understand what he's saying? These all died waiting, not having received the things promised. God made significant promises to Abraham. We talked about these Thursday night, so I won't go into great detail on all of them, but he promised a great family. When Abraham died, he didn't have a great family. I mean, he had a qualitatively, I don't know if it was great or not. A lot of times it wasn't, but I'm saying big. It was not a big family. His descendants didn't number like the sands of the seashore, as it says in verse 12. He didn't see that come to pass. God also promised they would have a land. Well, they were there as sojourners, but it wasn't their land. They were, at best, welcome exiles, and at worst, trespassers in the land. But God said, this is yours. They were waiting for it. They did not see it. They greeted them from afar, acknowledging that they were strangers and exiles. Actually, this wasn't just Abraham. So Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac lives through. You're like, okay, so probably God's, now Abraham's family won't have to wait anymore. God will give all the promises to Isaac. Isaac barely saw any more promises than his dad saw fulfilled. Isaac had two more sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob in particular is the one through which the promises came. You think, oh, okay, well now we're at Abraham's grandson. Surely now God will do all the stuff. Jacob barely lived any of his life in the land of promise. And most of it he lived, well, actually all of it, he lived in tents. He didn't possess a single foot of it. And actually at the end of his life, Jacob was taken with his family down into Egypt where they lived. He didn't even die in the homeland that he supposedly was going to inherit, that God promised to him. And then one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, who was ultimately sort of a ruler of Egypt, one of the most powerful rulers of Egypt, he didn't see the promises come true either. Look at verses 20 through 22 that describe this family's life. By faith invoked future blessings. By faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. They were waiting. They didn't come to pass in his life. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. He invoked a blessing for the future. He was waiting. They were waiting. Verse 22, by faith Joseph at the end of his life made mention of the exodus of the Israelites, which I will tell you happened over 400 years after Joseph died. They were waiting. It's difficult to live the life of a sojourner because it's a life of waiting, not receiving, not getting, not having things exactly like you like them. It's a life of waiting. I'll tell you one more thing about why it's difficult, and I want us to shift gears onto how we can keep going through these why we would go through these difficulties and how. The life of a sojourner is difficult because, especially when you're sojourning by faith in God, it's a life where you're going to be tested. All that stuff I just said, obviously. Notice the test that Abraham had to face in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, who you love, and present him to me as an offering. Now this was shocking. God had never said anything like this, indicated anything like this. This would have been very disturbing, especially because for decades of Abraham's life, God had promised, I'm going to give you a son, and it's going to be Isaac, and he's going to be the one that I'm going to bring all these promises. God, how could you do this? This doesn't make sense to me. And also, this is kind of horrifying that you would even ask for this. You know what Abraham did? That sojourner got up early in the morning, and he went and did what God had him do. Because he understood that if you're going to sojourn with God, if you're going to go with God, you got to submit to him. And that's going to cause all kinds of complications and challenges. But he passed the test. By the way, you may remember the rest of the story. And if you don't know the story, I'll just go ahead and tell you so that you're not left hanging on this. God really didn't want Abraham to sacrifice his son. God has never asked for human sacrifice. It's abhorrent to him. The test was, what if I did? What if I did want your son? Would you have enough faith in me to give up everything? Or do you have to secure yourself in this world? In other words, are you willing to go wherever I'll lead you in your sojourn? Or are you going to have to grab the wheel once in a while? Sojourning is difficult. Abraham, what made you decide to do this sojourning stuff? Because none of that sounds pleasant. None of that sounds fun. None of that sounds like anything that I would want to do. What's guiding your decision making on this? Well, I think what Abraham would say to us is that he was a sojourner guided by God's command. Sojourning means that you are guided by God's command. This really relates to the idea of submission that we talked about earlier. But I just want you to know, it's not just this kind of idea of like, oh yeah, whatever God says, but I'm going to hopefully not listen to anything God says because I don't really want to do it. To be somebody who really sojourns with God, that goes on the journey with God, you've got to be guided by the command of God. Let me tell you some alternatives that you could be guided by on your journey. Maybe to put it this way, the map and compass that you might follow on your journey. For some of us, what we'd be guided by is our personal preferences, whatever they may be. They may be impulses of the moment. They may be values that we've kind of developed over our time living in the world. Whatever. We got all this kind of stuff, and this is my preference of how I would like my life to go. That's my compass. That's the roadmap that I'm looking to follow. For others of us, it may be a subset of personal preference, but it's the pressure that comes from outside. I may not even want to act this way, do this thing, do that thing, but I'm getting so much pressure from my family, from my friends, from my job, and so these pressures around me lead me to make XYZ decision. In other words, that's the command that I follow, whatever the pressures are around me. And then maybe there's a third thing that we might be guided by, and that's pragmatism. What I mean is we might say, okay, what do you think is going to work out the best? I mean, I don't really want to do it. And it's not even that people are pressuring me, but I need to be pragmatic here. If I leave my home and go live in tents, my family may be killed. That was possible for Abraham. If I go, I'm going to miss out on some real financial advantages that I would have. That certainly was a possibility. Abraham could have been pragmatic, and his family at some point. At some point, Isaac could have said, Dad led the family out here on this sojourn, but honestly, look at what's going on. None of the promises have come true yet, and we're in all this trouble. Actually, some of the people don't even like us being here. This is not very pragmatic. It's not very practical. Let's get out of here. And some of us, that's how we make our decisions. What's the most practical thing? What's the most pragmatic thing? Listen, y'all, your personal preference, pressures from outside, your judgment and opinion, by the way, on what's pragmatic. You may think it's pragmatic. You don't know the future, but you think it's going to work out. Those things are terrible guides. They are terrible guides. Instead of pointing north like they claim to be, they're pointing the opposite direction. They're taking you away from where you ought to go and what you ought to do. We got to be people that make sure we, like Abraham, listen to the word of God. Hebrews 11 and verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called. He didn't think, I think this would be a good idea. It wasn't everybody pushing him out of his home. It wasn't any of that other stuff. He obeyed when he was called. I actually want to take you to a scripture that speaks to this. Go over to 1 Peter. We might go to 1 Peter just a couple times. I mentioned earlier that the book of 1 Peter is addressed to people, Christians, who are encouraged to think of themselves as sojourners, just like Abraham. As a matter of fact, Abraham's wife Sarah even is invoked in this book as a model for particularly wives to understand how to live by faith. But I want you to listen to 1 Peter chapter 1. I want to read verses 14 beginning through 16. Listen to this. He says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. That kind of sounds like that personal preference stuff. I prefer to do this. Well, why do you prefer that? Well, because my passion will lead me this way. But as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Why? Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Skip down to verse 22. Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth, for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart. Since you have been born again, you're not a part of this world anymore. You have a new life. Not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and abiding Word of God. The thing that guides us through our sojourn is not what we've experienced before in the world, or the pressures of the world around us, or our preferences, or what we think is the most pragmatic way to live. It was foolishness for Abraham to live the way he lived. It was foolishness for Joseph whenever he was sent down into Egypt as a slave, when his brothers, I should say, sold him as a slave in Egypt. Why would he keep on serving God whenever he was there and that woman tried to get him to lie with her? Why would he help people whenever he was wrongly sent to prison? Why would he do all that stuff? It was not pragmatic. Forget about it. Give up on God. He couldn't, because he was being guided by God's command, not by what he thought was going on in the world. Verse 24, for all flesh is like grass, and all its glory is like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this is the good news that was preached to you. What this is saying is, if you are guided by all those other things, they will fail you. The only thing that will sustain you through your journey in life is the word of God, the command of God. So actually, we might say to Abraham, man, you have such a difficult life living like a sojourner. I love living in my nice Canaanite city over here. So stable, so secure. I have such a sense of belonging. Abraham might could say to us, yeah? What about when the government changes hands? Is it going to be stable then? What about whenever the Canaanite economy crashes? Is everything going to be cool then? You guys have your philosophy and your religion, but what about when there's a new philosophy or a new religion in your culture? Is all that great stability going to actually work for you? Actually, Abraham might say to us, I know my life may look a little more difficult and a little more unstable. Actually, I'm a lot more stable. Because I never have to question where I'm getting my marching orders from. I don't have to look inside. By the way, think about that when I was saying, some people are guided by personal preference. Do you have some preferences now that you didn't have in the past? Actually, do you look back on some preferences you had in the past and you're like, yikes. Some of y'all, if you could, I don't know, Freaky Friday style, teleport back into high school, would you just sit down high school you and be like, dude, what's up with the outfit here? What are we doing? What's that all about? Some of y'all would. You hate those pictures of you when you were in middle school or whatever. But then, of course, younger you would have been like, this boomer over here keeps telling me to change. What's going on? Why is that? Who's right, by the way? Well, your personal preferences change over time. They're not stable. They're not reliable. You can't count on them. Certainly the pressures you receive. When you're in one place, have you ever seen this in yourself? And God help us. Where we're in one situation and I receive these pressures to act or behave in a certain way, and I do. And then I go over in this setting over here and I behave in a totally opposite way. I'm so irrational in that. So unstable, so insecure. What Abraham teaches us is if you want to have a stable life, actually sojourning is the best way to do it. If you want to know the way you're going, and you don't know where you're going because you're just going wherever God tells you to go, but you understand what I mean. If you want to know at the end of the day, I'm going wherever God says. Abraham had a simple answer every day. Hey, what are we doing tomorrow? Whatever God tells us to. Everybody else in Canaan, all those people with those nice walled cities and ancient cultures and power and blah, 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 they didn't know what they were doing. I don't know. They were having to generate ideas. They were having to come up with stuff or trying to look to each other. What are we going to do about this? But not Abraham, not the sojourners, not us, y'all. If we live by the command of God, if we are people of faith, then we always know where we're going. We're always going wherever God tells us to. And I got to tell you, that's a great benefit. Not only because it just gives us clarity on the direction of our lives as we sojourn with God, it also resets our expectations for life in this world. All right, so first of all, sojourning, difficult life. We outlined a number of the difficulties that Abraham and his family faced. Sojourning is guided by God's command when you're sojourning by faith. And whenever you're sojourning by faith, God gives you this great gift of resetting your expectations of life in the world. You think Abraham ever was surprised whenever people didn't like that he was in their land? I would guess probably not. I'm sure he didn't like it. I'm sure it wasn't very nice, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it would have been very surprising. You think Abraham was surprised whenever the tent leaked? I don't know if his tents leaked, but my guess is they leaked. You think he was surprised? No, it's a tent. Now, what if Abraham had lived in an imaginary world? Maybe let's fast forward to some of the other guys. What if Jacob had lived in an imaginary world where he thought he was living in a house? Or maybe put it a different way, he thought he was never going to have to deal with leaks. You might say, Jacob, dude, you live in a tent. You're going to have some leaks in this thing whenever it rains. You know, some of us, we think that this world can work out for us. Whatever. And I mean, you fill in the blank. Your physical health, your job, your finances, your relationships. We think that everything can get set up really nicely. But the truth is, and here's the sneaky thing, actually all of us are exiles. Every human being has been exiled from the goodness of God and the presence of God as we live in this world that's ruled by the evil one. The sojourners are the people who understand that. and have by faith had their expectations reset to where they're not disturbed by this. They understand, I'm a sojourner. There's going to be scarcity sometimes. People aren't going to like me sometimes. I don't expect the world to match up with my values. Maybe ever. After all, I'm a foreigner here. I'm a foreigner here. I don't belong here, and they don't think I belong here. And so it's not going to match up. And so I'm not pleased about all those difficulties that come, but my expectations are properly calibrated. Y'all know that probably for all time since the gospel, I would imagine, was first preached, but certainly in this country throughout history, there's been a sort of an expectation of like, hey, this country is going to embrace God's values. I just want us to stop believing that lie. It never has, and never will. Now, maybe, I'm always thankful when some of God's values are adopted. That's always good. That makes it better when we're sojourning here. But this place is not the kingdom of heaven, nor is any kingdom of man the kingdom of heaven. And so we're sojourning in this place. And so we don't expect everything. And so when you just get so flustered, oh, I can't believe actually, it should be the other way. Whenever I see some righteousness, when I see some justice, when I see some compassion, I should be like, wow, that is so great. A pleasant surprise. Because when you're a sojourner, you know that the way you're living, the way you're thinking isn't like anyone else or anything else. And I want to show you actually in Hebrews 11 how having your expectations properly calibrated, understand that you're a sojourner, will help you in life. So I've been talking about maybe the way that we view the world around us. Let me give it another side of sojourning. Sojourning, as we said, is you're waiting, right? You're looking forward to something. But they never received it. Remember the text said that. They never received the promises. Back there in verse 13. They were seeking a homeland. Verse 14 of chapter 11. And they could have gone back to their old land, but they were still looking for something else. If you were going as a sojourner throughout your life, you know what I think one temptation might be? Bitterness. It's never been good. It's always been bad. It's just been difficulty after difficulty and waiting upon waiting. And I'll tell you, some of these guys in particular could have been made bitter. Bitter by their own sins, bitter by the things that they received. But what does it say about Isaac at the end of his life? Isaac, who the last picture we have of Isaac is, he is so old and blind, he can't figure out that one of his sons is tricking him, pretending like he's the other son. That is sad, don't you think? I mean, God help us all as we age. I hope that that's not my story, but that may be. It's really pathetic. That's him. He's laid up on his bed. They have to cook him some food. He barely is able to get up. That's Isaac. Y'all ever met some older folks like that? I can think of some I've known. What's their attitude like whenever everything's broken down? Are they those happy, joyful, they're glad to see you or not, no. They're bitter. Angry. They think about all they've lost. What does verse 20 say Isaac was thinking about? Isaac invoked future blessings. He wasn't made bitter by his life. When I say, Isaac, you literally never had a home, bro. At least your dad could say he was from Haran, all those places where he lived growing up. But you never had a home. You've always been a tent dweller in this place where people don't want you. You say, yeah. I mean, that's what I expected. Our family are sojourners. We're trusting in God. We're guided by His command. So I'm not upset about it. My expectations were set by being a sojourner. That I was never going to have an easy, nice life. There would be a lot of bitter things that would happen. Same with Jacob, verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, Jacob, who had all kinds of stuff about Jacob we could say, but I'll just say noteworthy, wife, dead, years of famine, decades of thinking his son had been killed, all this kind of stuff. But what is Jacob at the end of his life? By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship. In other words, he still was looking to God. And by the way, if you study the story of Jacob, a lot of his life, he didn't really trust in God. I should have said this at the beginning. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all these guys, they weren't angels. They weren't Boy Scouts. They did a lot of really bad, dark stuff. Sojourning doesn't mean you're perfect, all right? Maybe more on that in just a second. But he worships. He's looking at God. He's not been made bitter by his circumstances. Understanding yourself as a sojourner sets the proper expectations. Same with Joseph that you see there in verse 22. A lot of us are made bitter because, oh, God's not doing enough good stuff for me, or why is it so hard for me, or why, or whatever. Well, because we're not done yet. We're sojourning. We haven't put it in park. This isn't the place where God said everything's going to go good. Understanding that we're on a journey, that we're going somewhere, that God's taking us somewhere, sets better expectations. I like what Peter says in a couple places in the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21, after talking about some, frankly, extremely difficult commandments that God gives to his sojourners, in verse 21 of 1 Peter 2, he says, "For to this you have been called." Just like Abraham was called, you've been called. Well, to what? What is our calling? Verse 21. "Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." What should my expectation be in society, in my job, even in family relations, even with people that I care about who care about me? What should be my expectation? Suffering. I'm not trying to bum you out, but I'm just telling you the truth. That's what sojourning is. My expectation is. So actually, whenever that stuff doesn't happen, it's a very pleasant surprise. And it's something I'm very grateful for. And whenever it does happen, whenever the suffering comes as I follow God on my sojourn, it's something I say, hey, this was bound to happen. Look over at chapter 4 and verse 12. Chapter 4 and verse 12, he says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you." Why is it so hard? Why is it this way? Dude, why are you surprised? You should not. This is not something surprising. This is exactly what it is to live the life of sojourn. And I'll tell you, the quicker that I accept that, the quicker that you accept and embrace that, and have my expectations for what my life will be properly calibrated to living as a sojourner, I'm going to tell you, there's a lot more opportunity for joy and peace. There's a lot more opportunity for joy and peace. And maybe you've seen that. I talked about those bitter old people. Haven't you also seen those older folks, more seasoned folks, mature folks, who whenever they first found out about the diagnosis, whenever they first lost that person that they loved, whenever they first faced financial ruin, it was terribly destabilizing, confusing, and bewildering, but eventually they accepted it. And it reset their expectations to such a point that they weren't bitter and angry. They were actually quite joyful. They looked forward to a better future. They were able to contribute well to the lives of others because they understood, this is what I'm going through, but I don't have to be enslaved to my circumstances because I understand that I'm on a journey and I'm going to keep on going. All right, last thing I want to say, back in Hebrews 11. Living the life of faith is a life of sojourning. Sojourning is a difficult life, as we see through the life of Abraham and his family. But it's a life that we can only navigate the difficulties, and difficulties we'll face it all, if we're guided by God's command. We'll actually have many more difficulties if we try to navigate our journey any other way. We've got to be guided by God's command and allow the fact that we're sojourning to reset our expectations for life in the world so we won't be made bitter, but actually we'll be able to have joy and peace knowing what God has in store for us. And that is what it was. They weren't just resigned in sort of, y'all may know some Eastern philosophies really encourage, hey, just divorce yourself from even thinking about pain, just pretend like pain even doesn't exist, blah, blah, blah. That's not what we're talking about here, y'all. The reason why they still had joy and peace in spite of their difficulty, the reason why they said, hey, God's commandment is good even when it takes me into something hard, the reason why their expectations allowed them to have joy and peace was because they knew what was coming up ahead. What did it say? Well, actually, notice this. Notice how many times there are future words in this passage. Chapter 11 and verse 8 talks about the inheritance that he was to receive. Verse 9, the land of promise, and how they all inherit. They were heirs of the same promise, verse 9. They were looking forward to the city that has foundations. Verse 11, it says, Sarah considered him, that is God, faithful, who had promised. And then verse 13, they had not received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. You can keep on going yourself. You get the point, right? Living a life of a sojourner is a life of hope. It's not a life of hopelessness. It's a life of hope. Hope, not wishing, but confidently expecting that God's going to come through with what he says. And not because we were so good or deserved it. I'll encourage you again. Go read the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These guys were sometimes kind of scoundrels. Lying about whether or not your wife was your wife and allowing another man to take her to save your own skin. cheating, everybody in your life, your own brother, your dad, having multiple wives just to satisfy your own pleasures and interests, ignoring what it's a disturbing story actually when you read about it. These people weren't going to receive anything because they were so good, but it's because they believed in the promise of God's grace, that He was going to do good for them and to them and through them and for them. He promised it. What are you living for? Two things I think the devil wants us to live for, probably a lot more. He wants us to live for right now, and he wants us to live for what we can get. And I'll underline that word "we." He wants to live for right now. Don't think about the future. Don't think about what's ahead. You're in so much pain now. This is so tough now. Give up on this sojourn. Put it in park here in this Canaanite city. You can't beat them. Join them. Just participate in all this evil. Don't keep living for that future hope that God has given you. No. That's foolishness. And Abraham tells us, nah, man, y'all got to keep going. Jacob and Joseph, they tell us you got to look ahead to what God's promised. Don't be living for the right now. But the other thing is we live for what we can get. Or maybe I should say what we can get for ourselves. Meanwhile, God said, I'll give you stuff you could never get for yourself. Abraham and Sarah, they were as good as dead. And God gave life in their son, Isaac. Isaac, when he became an old man, he hadn't received all the promises, but he knew God, and he couldn't do anything to get them for his family. Same for Jacob, same for Joseph. But what they did believe was in their God, who was gracious. What does it say in verse 10? Who's the builder of the home of the sojourners? Who's the designer of the home of the sojourners? It's not them. It's God. He's the one who gives them this hope. Verse 14, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. And what makes it better isn't just that it's in another space than the space we occupy. What makes it better is the end of verse 16. Not that they built a city where they can enjoy it for themselves and be proud of the accomplishments. No. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. That's the real hope we have. As Peter concludes his letter in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 10, the promise is that one day the God of all grace will himself confirm and perfect and establish you. That's what it's all about, y'all. That's why we're sojourning. We know, y'all, and I know we haven't seen it yet, we haven't tasted it yet, we haven't touched it yet, but God's track record has made it such that whatever He says, we know it's going to come to pass, and we know that He has a place prepared for us, that He has a home where we'll dwell with Him as His children, a place where He'll bring us to the completion of our sojourn. We're not going to be sojourning forever. And we're not going to die without having received, well, I guess we actually will. That's true. We will die without having received the promises, at least all of them. There's a whole lot of promises we're receiving along the way. Joy and peace, forgiveness of sins, the love of God from Him and from His people. There's all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, one day, He's going to come back. And He's going to raise us all up from the dead. And we'll know that our sojourn was worth it. We're not going to raise ourselves. We're not going to provide it for ourselves. He's going to provide it for us by His grace. Just like He did for Abraham. Just like He did for Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and frankly all the people of faith throughout history. Imperfect, flawed, troubled people who've known I can't give up on the journey. I can't start walking a different path. I can't be following my own guidance or the guidance of the world. And even though it's difficult, God's going to be the one who guides me. And I'm not going to expect it to be all nice and wonderful and rosy down here because after all, I'm sojourning. It's a little tough living in tents out here in this world. But I know one day I won't live in a tent anymore. One day, if I keep on going out of this world on the journey following Jesus, then He'll bring me home to that city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Jesus, draw me ever nearer as I labor through the storm. You have called me to this passage, and I'll follow, though I'm worn. How about we sing verse 3 in the chorus? Let the treasures of the trial form within me as I go. At the end of this long passage, let me leave them at your throne. May